Russian propaganda channels blast victory music and parade their latest wonder weapons whenever something positive happens in Ukraine, even if it's capturing a small village. But this hides the reality behind the Kremlin's war machine, which tells a completely different story. 3.5 years into what Putin promised would be a swift operation, Russia isn't just losing the war, it's literally running out of everything needed to fight one, and the numbers are brutal. From frontline drones to basic rubber tires, Russia's military-industrial complex is hemorrhaging critical supplies at a rate that would make any defense minister break into a cold sweat. In short, Russia's military is drying up. Let's dive in. To truly grasp the magnitude of this collapse, we need to understand how each shortage represents not just a tactical problem but the systematic breakdown of military systems built over decades. Let's start with something that should terrify anyone planning Russian military operations, a model of warfare that was practically unknown before the 2020s. We're talking about drones, more specifically, small first-person view drones. When even Russian President Vladimir Putin admits his troops are running short on equipment, you know the situation is desperate. In a rare moment of public honesty, Putin recently ordered Russian factories to urgently increase FPV drone production. To quote, "I know perfectly well, and many of those participating in our meeting today know it no worse than I do, that these means of defeat are still insufficient. The numbers that are insufficient are borderline impossible to comprehend." According to that same source, Russia has procured over 1.5 million drones, and roughly 4,000 FPV drones are being shipped to the front line each day. Yet Russia still doesn't believe this is enough. Of course, you only need to take stock of the minuscule territorial gains to realize that Putin might, for once, be telling the truth. At the end of 2022, Russia controlled roughly 18% of Ukraine's territory. 2.5 years later, that percentage went up to a disputed 20%. It took Russia 1.5 million drones, among other things, as you'll soon discover, to capture only about 2% of Ukraine's territory. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how warfare has fundamentally changed. FPV drones are essentially commercial drones, ones used for games or photo shoots, but with explosives or other equipment attached. They are small, cheap aircraft, costing anywhere from $500 to $3,000 each, compared to traditional military systems costing millions. This represents the same kind of revolutionary shift that occurred during World War I, when military aviation evolved from reconnaissance curiosity to battlefield necessity within just 4 years. Both Russia and Ukraine keep inventing new forms of FPV drones every few months, all in an effort to one-up each other. And that's where Russia's crisis becomes clear. When the war began in 2022, both sides used drones primarily for observation, following traditional military doctrine. But Ukrainian forces quickly adapted, and by 2024 were deploying thousands of FPV drones daily for precision strikes, turning cheaper consumer electronics into tank-killing weapons. Russia, meanwhile, remained locked in thinking patterns developed during the Soviet era. Traditional Russian military doctrine emphasized massive, centralized firepower. Think Katyusha rocket salvos or concentrated artillery barrages that could devastate large areas simultaneously. But modern conflict requires distributed, precise capabilities that small drones provide. When Putin orders factories to increase drone production, he's essentially admitting that Russia's military-industrial complex failed to anticipate that the war would last for so long, accrue so many losses, or require such an economic and industrial commitment. The deeper manufacturing problem reveals why this shortage is so critical. Ukraine has converted civilian electronics factories to military drone production using readily available components like smartphone cameras and gaming controllers. Russia, despite having a larger industrial base, struggles with this conversion because its defense industry operates under completely different principles: centralized, secretive, and optimized for large platform weapons. It's like trying to use a factory designed to build locomotives to suddenly start producing bicycles. Without adequate FPV drone coverage, Russian battalions are operating essentially blind, forced to rely on outdated reconnaissance methods while Ukrainian drone swarms pick apart their positions with surgical precision. The next part on the list is something that Russia arguably had a significant supply of when the war started: precision-guided missiles. Remember those sleek Caliber cruise missiles and Iskander ballistic missiles that Russia loved showing off in military parades? Well, defense analysts have noticed something fascinating and worrying for Putin. Russia has quietly shifted from using these high-precision, expensive weapons to literally firing Soviet-era surface-to-air missiles at ground targets. To appreciate how dramatic this shift is, we need to understand what precision-guided munitions represented for modern warfare. A single Caliber cruise missile costs approximately $1 million, but can destroy a target that might require dozens of conventional artillery shells to eliminate. Plus, a precision-guided missile has an operational range that can span over 100 miles, while artillery struggles to go over 25 miles. These weapons use GPS guidance, inertial navigation, and terminal seekers to hit targets within meters of their intended impact point, and were supposed to be Russia's direct answer to Americans' smart weapon technology. But now Russia is taking S-300 air defense missiles, designed in the 1970s to shoot down NATO aircraft at high altitudes, and repurposing them as crude ground attack weapons. The S-300 system was part of a Soviet integrated air defense, meant to protect against strategic bombers and fighter aircraft, not to crater Ukrainian positions. It's considered relatively obsolete against modern aircraft, but definitely not those fielded by Ukraine at the moment, which are aging F-16s and Mirage 2000s at best. The historical significance of this conversion cannot be overstated. When military forces start using air defense missiles for ground attack, they're essentially admitting they've exhausted their conventional precision strike capabilities. This also reeks of desperation, because S-300 missiles are far less accurate against ground targets, since they're meant to be radar-guided or follow heat signatures, and much more expensive than purpose-built artillery rounds. This is because by mid-2023, Russia's military-industrial complex was only producing 60 guided missiles per month of an unspecified model, which wasn't sufficient to provide enough pressure on Ukraine alone. Therefore, Russia's long-range strategy started to include glide bombs, a relatively simple Soviet-era Fab 500, meaning 500 kilograms or 1,100 pounds of explosive, ammunition fitted with a relatively modern inertial guidance system and some aerodynamic wings. Russia has also used Fab 500's older cousins, the Fab 1000 and the Fab 3000, again the numbers indicating kilograms of explosive. The Fab 500 is considered to be the model they possess the most of, as the Soviet Union stocked up on them in the event of a war against the US, where it would have to play defense. Granted, glide bombs would end up being extremely effective at straining Ukraine's defensive systems. However, their sheer inaccuracy means that if Russia is launching roughly 3,000 of these bombs per month, according to statistics from January 2025, they usually strike empty fields rather than anything of importance. So we've dropped from state-of-the-art precision missiles to interceptors to dumb bombs made smarter with some duct tape and electronics. It's not exactly what the world expected from the supposed second greatest military. And even then, neither of those solutions is going to be an endless supply due to Russia's failure to acquire enough microchips. Modern warfare practically runs on microchips, and Russia's semiconductor supply chain is in freefall. In March 2025, a critical semiconductor plant in Stavropol that supplies airplane parts simply shut down because it couldn't cover operating costs. Simply put, the government was willing to pay less for a chip than it would cost the company to procure and make. Considering that the country's military and defense budget for 2025 is roughly 40% of government spending, it's telling that even military contractors are being underfunded and forced to basically eat monetary losses in the short term or close their doors. And this trend is likely to continue, as microchip manufacturers are forced to bypass increasing sanctions when they import foreign materials and technology. This happened due to Russia being dependent on imports for military parts, which stems from the economic crisis after the Soviet Union's collapse in the 1990s. Russian companies at the time found it cheaper and more efficient to import Western components rather than maintain expensive domestic production, and the practice never really stopped. This dependency creates vulnerabilities that we're only seeing decades later. Without the ability to access the global market, Russia has no other option but to turn to the black market or get underperforming material from its few allies, China and Iran. In either case, the operational costs of running businesses without legitimate high-grade parts are only going to get worse for Russia. In turn, they would cut corners to preserve operational capacities, creating subpar equipment for the Russian military. And we've already seen the results of this beyond the microchip plant itself. All the way back in May 2022, a presumably Russian Su-34 was found with a commercial GPS taped to the cockpit because the native one simply stopped performing. But even if Russia could solve its chip crisis overnight, it's facing an even more fundamental problem. It's running out of explosives. State documents and satellite imagery reveal that Moscow is desperately rushing to complete a new RDX production facility in Siberia. Why the panic? Because Russia's existing explosive reserves are critically low, and the imported substitutes from North Korea are so poor quality that they're practically useless. TNT and RDX are yet another foundation of modern weaponry. They fill artillery shells, missile warheads, bombs, and demolition charges. Without adequate explosive production, an army can have all the delivery systems in the world, but nothing effective to deliver. Consider that Russia has been able to churn out 3 million artillery rounds per year, more than the entirety of NATO combined. This is part of the reason why Russia has actually been able to make some progress in the war, however slow it was and the losses it incurred. But the artillery shells that Russia can create aren't worth much if they can successfully be defended against, and Ukraine made sure of that by performing increasingly long-range attacks via domestically produced drones. This was because a lot of Russian manufacturing was actually west of Moscow, where it would be closer to the imagined front line with NATO. Plus, Ukraine was a large part of the Soviet Union's manufacturing capability back then, so ammo storage was relatively close, so it made sense. This turned into a disadvantage as Ukraine could target munitions depots, light a small spark, literally, and watch as the entire depot went up in flames from the stored munitions exploding. And even the new factory might not be able to make a difference. Even if it's deeper in Siberia, Ukraine has showcased that it can smuggle drones into Russia and perform attacks that are over 2,500 miles from Ukraine's borders, such as the famous Operation Spiderweb. This leaves very little of Russia safe from attack, and the farther east the manufacturing goes, the more complex and costly the logistics become to supply the front line. It's simply a lose-lose situation. But Russia also has problems that go much deeper than that. Its entire army is collapsing from within, as Russia is running out of competent junior officers. In Western militaries, junior officers like lieutenants and captains serve as the crucial link between strategic planning and tactical execution. These officers typically have 4 to 8 years of professional military education and experience, combining technical expertise with leadership capabilities developed through specialized training programs. Russia's military education system historically followed the Soviet model, with extensive officer training programs producing highly educated military professionals. The Soviet Union operated dozens of military academies and institutes, creating an officer corps with deep technical knowledge and a systematic military education. This system produced competent professionals, but it required enormous amounts of time and resource investments that couldn't quickly be replaced. However, unlike the West, Russia has heavily decentralized performance monitoring and reporting to each educational facility. This meant that each academy could be training its officers differently depending on how ambitious or lazy the training officers in it were. As a result, Russia's military echelons ended up being highly unequal between one place and the next. Worse yet, Russia's military doctrine hasn't yet caught up to the West. It still largely practices predetermined simulations and reinforces a top-down chain of command, where orders are meant to be followed regardless of battlefield conditions. And these aren't conscripts that can be trained in a few weeks, but professional soldiers with supposedly years of specialized education and experience. The current shortage has cascading effects throughout the military hierarchy that compounded over time. In 2024, Russia made plans to establish 33 new military training schools, which technically should help the issue, but it's going to be likely too late to matter. Even under optimistic projections, these institutions won't produce meaningful numbers of qualified officers until 2028 or 2030. That's another 3 to 5 years of a war that has already seen Russia lose 1 million soldiers in 3.5 years. But perhaps the most damning indicator of Russia's crisis isn't on the battlefield at all, but in the budget spreadsheets. Oil and gas revenues, Russia's primary income source, plummeted 34% year-over-year in June 2025. Meanwhile, defense spending now devours 40% of the entire federal budget, which has an understandably crippling effect on the rest of the economy. Russia's fiscal crisis is a culmination of economic decisions made over decades, creating vulnerabilities that sanctions have now exposed. During the 2000s oil boom, energy exports provided such enormous revenues that they financed military modernization, social programs, and foreign policy ambitions simultaneously. Russia became addicted to energy revenues, and it channeled its deep resource capabilities to influence global geopolitics. The EU in particular was a big importer of Russian oil and gas, which allowed Russia an unprecedented level of control over its internal politics. Even 3 years after the EU heavily reduced its dependence on Russian resources, some countries are still spending more on them than they are helping Ukraine. The decline in oil and gas revenues strikes at the core of Russia's entire economic model. Energy exports historically provided close to half of federal budget revenues, meaning that dramatic declines in this sector force immediate choices between military spending and domestic programs. And this is also exacerbated by Russia switching to basically a war economy. With the aforementioned 40% of its budget going to the military, a significant drop in one of the major parts of the income machine means that Russia will be forced to take funding from elsewhere. Considering how invested Russia is in winning the war, that's not going to be the military-industrial complex, but education, infrastructure, healthcare, or economic development. But there's only so much you can pull from the rest of the economy before it breaks. The Kremlin has already signaled spending cuts starting in 2026, essentially admitting it can't sustain current military expenditures. This has resulted in Russia turning to something that was considered reckless in modern times: Soviet machinery. Storage facilities that once housed thousands of Soviet-era vehicles now look like picked-over junkyards, revealing the systematic consumption of strategic reserves. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union produced over 44,000 tanks of various types, including T-64, T-72, and T-80, far more than any other nation in history. Eclipsing that is the old reliable T-55, which was estimated to have between 50,000 and 100,000 units worldwide. After 1991, Russia inherited enormous quantities of this equipment, stored in military depots across the country under varying conditions of preservation. Russia began this conflict by deploying modern T-80s and T-90s, then moved to refurbished T-72s as losses mounted. Now it's pulling T-55 tanks, which are essentially museum pieces from the 1950s, out of long-term storage and sending them into active combat zones. Each step backward in technology represents Russia consuming older, less capable equipment because newer systems have been exhausted, and the rest of the industrial complex isn't there to make new ones. To best illustrate that, all you need to do is look at the fabled T-14 Armata. The tank was supposed to be the pinnacle of main battle tanks, a direct counter to the West's technologically superior vehicles. Initial parades of the tank in 2015 came with incredulous statements that over 2,000 of them will be made by 2020. Unsurprisingly, that goal was pushed back to 2025. A more modest plan to deliver 100 vehicles by 2020 was announced later, but even that never materialized. And where are we now? With less than 20 tanks in service in the Russian forces, which were brought to the front in Ukraine and unceremoniously pulled back within weeks. If you need further convincing, all you need to do is look at the losses accrued. Oryx, a website dedicated to storing visual confirmations of losses accrued by both Russia and Ukraine, keeps a running tally of tanks lost in the war. By mid-2025, Russia had lost at least 4,000 tanks, with the actual number likely being much higher. The total losses of armored vehicles are at 13,000 by the same count, which is more than most countries have at their disposal. So it's no real surprise that Russia is starting to turn to older machines. There are simply no new ones being made, and even if they were, the T-90M shares the same devastating feature as the T-64, the autoloader. While the autoloading mechanism allows Russian tanks to have only 3 crew members, compared to Western counterparts 4, the mechanism stores the ammo relatively close to the tank turret and with a thin layer of armor to separate it from the interiors. Ukraine used this to launch small drones with anti-tank mines or even regular grenades close to the loader's storage. An explosion there could trigger a chain reaction with the ammunition stockpile, resulting in a completely destroyed tank. In a way, Russia using T-55s makes sense, as it's starting to treat its tanks with the same disregard as it does its human soldiers. Each tank is just another target on Ukraine's radar to soak up drone and precision missile strikes, all to win a war of attrition. But perhaps the most absurd indicator of Russia's supply crisis involves something most people never think about: rubber tires. Western sanctions have choked off Russia's access to high-quality rubber compounds and specialized tire manufacturing equipment. As a result, Russian military vehicles are running on tires so worn that they're at risk of becoming immobile. Western sanctions target not just finished tires, but the specialized chemicals and manufacturing equipment necessary for tire production. This creates supply chain bottlenecks that affect military mobility in ways that might not immediately be obvious. Some Western analysts have already picked up on this and reported that Russia might be entering a crisis where it can't supply enough tires for its vehicles or is using subpar parts. This might sound trivial until you realize that modern warfare depends entirely on mobility. An army that can't move is an army that dies, regardless of how sophisticated its weapons might be. Then there's the weather factor. As fall approaches, the ground in Ukraine will become a muddy mess from all the rain, which makes good tires practically a necessity. This will only worsen if the war goes on for another winter and spring, with snow and thaw further complicating the logistics of moving large armies across the 800-mile front. If we step back and look at the complete picture, these 8 crisis points work together to create what military theorists call systemic degradation, when multiple supply chain failures combine to reduce overall military effectiveness beyond what any single shortage might suggest. Russia entered this war believing it possessed the world's second most powerful military, backed by a robust defense industrial base and unlimited reserves of Soviet-era equipment. This confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. Russia did inherit enormous military capabilities and had spent decades modernizing key systems. 3.5 years later, Russia is rationing explosives, scraping museum tanks from storage, improvising weapons from air defense missiles, and literally running out of rubber tires. Putin's government is spending money it doesn't have on equipment it can't build with materials it can't access. Each shortage creates cascading effects that compound the others, like a series of mechanical failures bringing down an entire assembly line. This isn't just military degradation, it's the real-time collapse of a military-industrial complex that took decades to build. Russia's war machine isn't just drying up, it's systematically cannibalizing itself to fuel a conflict that's consuming resources faster than they can possibly be replaced. Thanks for watching. And to check out how Ukraine managed to achieve this, check out our video on drone warfare. And if you want to find out more about the war in Ukraine and global geopolitics, subscribe to The Military Show.